Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ba'd. All thanks and praise are due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and may His peace and blessings upon His last final messenger, His family, His companions, and those who follow them until the end of times. Good afternoon. Inshallah, everyone is doing well. Everyone's healthy and safe and excited for the month of Ramadan. It's literally right around the corner. And since most people usually pay their zakah in the month of Ramadan, expecting and hoping for extra reward, we thought it would be a good idea to have a webinar on the fiqh of zakah. A small session exploring all of the issues and rules and regulations related to this very important, this very fundamental act of worship that we have within Islam. So the purpose of today's webinar is to explore the fiqh of zakah, so that when we pay our zakah, we are doing it built upon a solid foundation of knowledge. So I want to start with a few preliminary remarks. First and foremost, talking about the concept of generosity in Islam. So generosity is this quality, it's this character trait that is recognized by every single religious tradition. It's considered to be one of those universal values. And oftentimes generosity is expressed through giving charity, by financially helping those who are less fortunate than us. And generosity and charity are a very important aspect of both our belief and practice. It's a very important expression of our iman. So our iman, our faith, it expresses itself in several different ways. And one of the ways in which it expresses itself is through charity and generosity. As a matter of fact, when we look towards the Quran, when we look towards the statements of the Prophet ﷺ, we find that generosity is one of the defining qualities of a true believer. Whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes al-mu'minun, whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the believers, He always mentions charity. He always mentions spending in the path of Allah, or spending from that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided us with. The Prophet ﷺ told us, as-sadaqatu burhanun. Charity is a proof. It is a proof of our sincerity. It's a proof of our devotion, our obedience, our servitude, and it is a proof of our iman. Now, sadaqah and zakah, they are very closely related to each other. But sadaqah is more general. Sadaqah is this general act of generosity, this general act of charity, whereas zakah is something very specific. So the root meaning of sadaqah, the word sadaqah we use for general charity, it comes from the word as-sidq, which means truthfulness. To behave as a believer is supposed to behave. So someone who's kind and generous, someone who's giving charity, is considered to be a person of as-sidq. Someone who's kind and generous and can be trusted not to harm others through speech or action. And as I mentioned, sadaqah is this very broad, this very general category. It's not limited to simply giving charity, but it includes any act of kindness that we engage in if it's done with the right intention. For example, smiling is sadaqah. Right? Smiling is also considered to be an act of charity. Helping someone carry their groceries is an act of sadaqah. Helping someone cross the street, helping someone carry something that's really heavy. All of these things can be considered to be sadaqah. And the Prophet ﷺ said, kullu ma'rufin sadaqah. Every good deed, every act of righteousness, everything the Sharia considers to be praiseworthy, sadaqah, is an act of sadaqah. It's an act of general charity. Zakah, on the other hand, again, is something very, very specific. It is specific to our wealth. It is a calculated amount of wealth that we have to give to those in need, to specific categories of people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself has highlighted in the Quran. So all of us, we're all aware of the fact that zakah is one of the pillars of Islam. It's one of the obligations that we have in life. And today we are going to be exploring this very important act of worship. Now, zakah is always linked with salah. Whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to establish salah in the Quran, He also gives us the command to pay zakah. وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ. Establish prayer and pay zakah. Right? يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ وَيُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ. The believers are those who establish prayer and pay their zakah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He does this in several passages, in several places throughout the entire Quran. Zakah is one of the pillars upon which Islam is built. As the Prophet ﷺ told us, بُنِيَ الْإِسْلَامُ عَلَى خَمْسٍ. Islam has been built upon 5. شَهَادَةُ أَنْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَأَنَّ مُحَمَّدًا رَسُولُ اللَّهِ. Bearing witness and testifying that there's nobody worthy of worship except Allah, and that Muhammad ﷺ is the messenger of Allah. وَإِقَامُ الصَّلَاةِ, establishing prayer. وَإِيتَاءُ الزَّكَاةِ, paying zakah. وَصَوْمُ رَمَضَانِ, fasting the month of Ramadan. وَحَجُّ الْبَيْتِ مَنِ اسْتَطَاعَ إِلَيْهِ سَبِيلًا, and performing Hajj for those who have the ability to do so. So zakah is one of the most important pillars of Islam. Its obligation is established through the Quran and through the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and it is considered to be the most important act of worship after Salah. And that's one of the reasons why Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu decided to wage war against those who refused to pay zakah after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ himself took the pledge of allegiance from his companions on establishing salah and paying zakah. So Jarir radiallahu anhu narrates that he pledged allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ upon establishing prayer, paying zakah, and sincerity towards every Muslim. And since paying zakah is such an important obligation, since it is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, it is very important for each and every single one of us to have a sound understanding of how to fulfill this obligation properly, of how to pay zakah in a manner, in a way that is acceptable to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So essentially, how do we fulfill this obligation properly and correctly? And that is the purpose of today's webinar. So I'm going to start our discussion by first and foremost talking about some of the virtues of zakah. One of the most beautiful things about our way of life, about Islam, is that every single act of worship, although it's something obligatory, although it's something we have to do, it is also a source of benefit for us, both in this world as well as in the world to come. So all of the acts of worship that we have in Islam, they're extremely beautiful, profound, and they carry a lot of reward. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah At-Tawbah, خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا وَصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ إِنَّ صَلَاتَكَ سَكَنٌ لَهُمْ وَاللَّهُ سَمِيعٌ عَلِيمٌ. That take sadaqah from their wealth, through which you may cleanse and purify them, and pray for them. Indeed, your prayer is a source of peace for them, and Allah is the all-hearing, the all-knowing. So in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's speaking directly to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's saying, خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً, that take sadaqah from their wealth. And the mufassirun, the scholars of the Quran, they mention that the word sadaqah here is referring to zakah. And this is something that when we study the Quran, we learn that oftentimes the words sadaqah and zakah in the Quran are used interchangeably. And the way we know which one is being referenced or which one is being referred to is through context, right? Through narrations and through whatever's in front and whatever comes after. Meaning the context gives us a good understanding of which type of, is it referring specifically to sadaqah or zakah. So خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً, take zakah from their wealth, تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا, and by doing so, you will cleanse and purify them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning 2 very important benefits of giving our zakah. تُطَهِّرُهُمْ, it's a process of cleansing. It cleanses our wealth. If we have earned wealth in some sort of impermissible way, unknowingly, then by virtue of giving zakah, it purifies, it cleanses the remainder of our wealth. وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا, and it's also a process of tazkiyah. It's spiritual purification. It removes the love of wealth from our hearts. إِنَّ صَلَاتَكَ سَكَنٌ لَهُمْ, truly your prayer is a source of peace for them. وَاللَّهُ سَمِيعٌ عَلِيمٌ, Allah is the all-hearing, the all-knowing. Now there's several ahadith that also speak about the virtues and blessings and rewards associated with paying zakah. And there are also several ahadith that give very severe warnings to those who consciously choose not to pay their zakah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah At-Tawbah that يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِنَّ كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْأَحْبَارِ وَالرُّهْبَانِ لَيَأْكُلُونَ أَمْوَالَ النَّاسِ بِالْبَاطِلِ وَيَصُدُّونَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَالَّذِينَ يَكْنِزُونَ الذَّهَبَ وَالْفِضَّةَ وَلَا يُنْفِقُونَهَا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ فَبَشِّرْهُم بِعَذَابٍ أَلِيمٍ يَوْمَ يُحْمَى عَلَيْهَا فِي نَارِ جَهَنَّمَ فَتُكْوَى بِهَا جِبَاهُهُمْ وَجُنُوبُهُمْ وَظُهُورُهُمْ هَذَا مَا كَنَزْتُمْ لِأَنفُسِكُمْ فَذُوقُوا مَا كُنْتُمْ تَكْنِزُونَ. These verses from Surah At-Tawbah are a very, very stern, a very severe warning from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala against those who accumulate wealth, who hoard their money. And part of hoarding money is choosing not to pay your zakah. وَالَّذِينَ يَكْنِزُونَ الذَّهَبَ وَالْفِضَّةَ. As for those who accumulate gold and silver, وَلَا يُنْفِقُونَهَا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. And they don't spend it in the way of Allah. They don't give charity, they don't pay their zakah. فَبَشِّرُهُمْ بِعَذَابٍ أَلِيمٍ. Give them the good news. Right? This is a sort of sarcasm in the Quran. Give them the good news of a painful punishment. Right? On the day, يَوْمَ يُحْمَى عَلَيْهَا فِي نَارِ جَهَنَّمَ. On the day that it will be heated up in the fire of hell. Meaning that gold and silver, that money they accumulated and hoarded, they didn't pay their zakah from it, it will be heated up on the day of judgment. فَتُكْوَى بِهَا جِبَاهُهُمْ وَجُنُوبُهُمْ وَظُهُورُهُمْ. Then their foreheads and their sides and their backs will be branded with it. هَذَا مَا كَنَزْتُمْ لِأَنفُسِكُمْ. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say to them as a scold, as reprimand, this is what you have accumulated for yourselves. فَذُوقُوا مَا كُنْتُمْ تَكْنِزُونَ. So taste what you have been accumulating. So this verse is literally meant to strike fear into the heart of people who have iman. This is a very severe, a very stern warning from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to those who consciously choose not to pay their zakah out of some sort of greed or out of some sort of like hubbud dunya, this intense love and connection to the material world. Right? In a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ told us, there hasn't been a nation that has refused to pay zakah except that Allah afflicts them with a drought. So people who refuse to pay zakah, they're not only harming themselves, but they're also harming the community around them. And because of that, it can have negative consequences, as highlighted by the Prophet ﷺ. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever Allah has given wealth, but he doesn't pay his zakah, his wealth will be turned into a venomous bald serpent with 2 black dots over its eyes. And this snake will wind around his neck and bite on that person's jaws and say, I'm your wealth, I'm your treasure. Then the Prophet ﷺ would recite this verse from Surah At-Tawbah, right? هَذَا مَا كَنَزْتُمْ لِأَنفُسِكُمْ فَذُوقُوا مَا كُنْتُمْ تَكْنِزُونَ. This is what you gathered and accumulated for yourself, so taste, meaning taste the evil consequences of what you used to hoard and gather and accumulate. Now, there are several benefits, there are several purposes, there are several objectives behind paying zakah, and I have a list of 5 things. This list is not exhaustive. There have been several papers and articles and even books that highlight the objectives, the maqasid, that highlight the fawaid, the benefits of paying zakah. And I just want to quickly highlight these 5. First and foremost, the purpose or objective of zakah is to distribute the wealth of the community amongst the poor. So it is an act of distributing wealth locally within the community. As mentioned in the famous hadith of Mu'adh radiallahu anh, that the Prophet ﷺ sent him as a governor to Yemen. Right? The Prophet ﷺ sends him as a governor, as a teacher to Yemen, and he gives them this methodology of inviting people to Islam. That first invite them to Islam. If they accept, then tell them to establish prayer. If they start establishing their prayer, then tell them to pay zakah. Inform them that Allah has made it an obligation upon them to pay zakah from their wealth. It is to be taken from the wealthy among them and given to the poor among them. Right? تُؤْخَذُ مِنْ أَغْنِيَائِهِمْ. Zakah is taken from their wealthy. وَتُرَدُّ عَلَى فُقَرَائِهِمْ. and it is given back to their poor, to their needy. So one of the main purposes, one of the main objectives of zakah is to distribute wealth within a community, so that those who are less fortunate, those who are struggling, those who are going through financial difficulties, some of their difficulties may be alleviated. The second is a more spiritual benefit, and that is removing the love of wealth from one's heart. So one of the most powerful, destructive spiritual diseases we have is something known as hubbud dunya, love, attachment to this material world. And by giving zakah every single year, it's a process of cleansing our hearts and removing that attachment, removing the love of wealth from our hearts. So it's a form of tazkiyah, it's a form of spiritual purification. Number 3, it counts as al-infaqu fi sabilillah. It counts as spending in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and acknowledging that whatever wealth we possess is in reality belongs to Allah. And that's a very important point. Whatever wealth, whatever material possessions, however much money we own, it is actually owned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He has given us authority and control over it. But that authority and control over our wealth is not 100% autonomous. It is subject to rules and regulations. That is why we can't earn money however we want, and we cannot pay money and spend money however we want, and we are obligated to spend a certain portion of it in charity as zakah. Number 4 is a more economic objective, which is to prevent monopolies in society. And I think perhaps the greatest objective behind zakah is that it is an expression of our obedience and submission to Allah. Why do we pay zakah? Because God told us to do so. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ. Establish prayer and pay zakah. So we pay zakah because it's an obligation, it is a commandment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by doing so, we are obeying His commandment. We're expressing our devotion, our servitude, our submission to Allah, which is the essence, which is the epitome of ibadah, of true servitude, of being a true servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And sometimes we may understand the purposes, the objectives and wisdoms behind a commandment, and sometimes we may not. But our responsibility as believers is to obey. Sami'na wa ata'na, we hear and we obey. So those are just some preliminary remarks regarding the virtues of zakah, some severe warnings against those who don't pay their zakah, and then some of the objectives and purposes and goals behind this very important act of worship. Now we're actually going to get into the fiqh. We are going to get into the rules and regulations of zakah. And usually, the way the jurists of the past, the way the scholars would approach any act of worship, is they would start off by defining it. They would provide a definition of the word itself. That what does this word zakah mean? Linguistically, right, in the Arabic language, what does this word mean? And then as an act of worship in Islam, what is it referring to? So linguistically, the meaning of zakah. Now, the reason why they make this distinction is that the Arabic language existed before Islam. The Arabic language existed before the Prophet ﷺ received revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these words conveyed certain meanings. They carried certain connotations before Islam. And then when Islam came, and when rules and regulations were revealed, these words took on a very particular meaning. So the word zakah linguistically, right, in the language of the Arabs, it refers to two things. Number 1, at-tahara. It refers to purity. And number 2, an-nama wa ziyada, right, growth and increase. And both of these linguistic meanings, they are found in the technical sense of the word as well. Why? Because when we pay zakah, as I mentioned, it's purifying our wealth, it's purifying our hearts. And when we pay zakah, it causes our wealth to increase and grow as well. Maybe not actual growth, but in terms of barakah for sure. So both of these linguistic meanings are actually found in the act of worship itself. Now, technically speaking, as an act of worship, the jurists, they would develop definitions that what they call jami' and mani'. So the fuqaha, they would try their best to come up with a definition that was all inclusive, at the same time all exclusive. It was trying its best to highlight what that act of worship is referring to. So as an act of worship, the fuqaha, they define zakah as the transfer of ownership of a portion of wealth. Right? The transfer of ownership of a portion of wealth, which is 2.5%, to a needy Muslim in such a way that the wealth is completely transferred with the intention. Now, every single part of this definition has significance to it, has importance. It's being highlighted for a reason. So number one, it's the transfer of ownership. So when I give zakah, I am transferring the ownership of my wealth to another individual. That's number one. When I pay zakah, when I fulfill this obligation, there's an actual transfer of ownership from myself to the one whom I'm paying zakah to. How much? 2.5% of my zakatable assets. Who is it being given to? To a needy Muslim. So a very important point, that the recipient of zakah has to be a Muslim. How? In such a way that the wealth is completely transferred. Meaning I, as the giver, will not have access to that wealth, and I will not benefit from that wealth in any way, shape, or form, with the intention. Because it's an act of worship, it requires niyyah. It requires an intention when paying it. So as we discussed earlier, the obligation of zakah is established through the Quran, it's established through the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And historically speaking, the fuqaha and the scholars mention that zakah was actually made obligatory during the Meccan period of prophethood. While the Prophet ﷺ was still in Mecca, zakah was legislated. But the exact details of how much to pay were not revealed at that time. It was left to the discretion of the companions. The details of zakah, they were revealed after migration to Medina. And for those of you that are familiar with the seerah, this is something we find common when it comes to legal rulings. That legal rulings developed and evolved gradually over time. Because the focus was first on the iman of the people. And once their iman was strong, once their faith was strong and solid, then the legal rulings were revealed. So for zakah, the obligation existed in Mecca, but the exact details of how much to pay, what assets to pay from, who to give it to, those were revealed after the migration, after the hijrah, and particularly in the second year after hijrah. Now, another definition that's given, and this is perhaps a little bit more detailed, is transferring ownership of an amount of material wealth specified by the lawgiver, specified by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, 2.5%, to a poor Muslim who is neither a Hashimi nor their client, meaning they're not from the descendants of the Prophet ﷺ, without material benefit returning to the giver in any way for the sake of Allah the Most High. So these are the technical definitions that are highlighted by our jurists and our scholars. A simple way and a very straightforward way is that zakah is a financial obligation. It is a financial act of worship in which those who are obligated to do so give 2.5% of their wealth to a needy Muslim. Right? That is the most simple, easy, straightforward way of understanding zakah. It is a financial act of worship. It's a financial obligation in which those that are obligated to will pay a certain percentage, a specific percentage of their assets to a poor and needy Muslim. Obviously, as an act of worship, it needs niyyah, it needs intention, and there has to be a complete transfer of ownership. And that's why before moving on to the actual rules and regulations, I want to highlight what we learned from this definition. That first and foremost, it is a condition, right? It is a condition that there be a transferring of ownership. And what that means in the most simple terms is your zakah has to be given to another individual, where the ownership of that wealth is being transferred from the one paying to the one who's receiving it. Right? There has to be an actual transfer of ownership. And that is why the fuqaha mentioned that forgiving a debt someone owes you can't count as zakah. So for example, if I had loaned someone $1,000 and they said they'll pay me back after a year, and now it's time for me to pay zakah, and I say, you know what, I forgive that debt, I forgive what he owes me, and that is going to be my zakah. That will not be considered to be valid, because in that sense there was no initial transfer of ownership, and also there was no intention at the beginning of giving it. Right? Second, zakah has to be given to the poor and needy. It has to be given to an individual who is a Muslim. Zakat cannot be used for welfare projects. It cannot be used for building masajid. It cannot be used for other virtuous activities like building a hospital or building a bridge or digging a well, etc., unless the zakat is actually given to the poor and needy. Third, zakah must be given to a Muslim. Right? Zakah has to be given to someone who's a Muslim, unlike sadaqah. Right? General charity can be given to anyone. Muslim or non-Muslim doesn't matter. But when it comes to zakah, the recipient has to be a Muslim. Number 4, zakah normally cannot be given to a Hashimi, someone who's from the descendants of the Prophet ﷺ. And the last one is that the giver, the one paying zakah, cannot materially benefit from giving their zakah. Right? They cannot benefit from the zakat they're giving, and that's why you can't give zakat to your parents, you can't give zakat to your children, you can't give zakat to your spouse, because the benefits between these people are shared. Right? They're commonly shared. Alright, now who has to pay zakah? Who has to give zakah? And what type of wealth is zakah due from? So understanding these conditions are very important, because this will give us an understanding, this will give us an idea if I personally am obligated to pay zakah or not. So when it comes to talking about the conditions of when and how zakah becomes an obligation, there are 2 sets. So when trying to understand when and how zakah becomes an individual obligation, we are looking at 2 separate sets of conditions. Right? One set of conditions is related to the individual. One set of conditions is related to me, myself, as an individual. And the other set of conditions is related to the wealth itself. So we'll talk about each of these in some detail. So there are 5 conditions related to the individual. There are 5 specific conditions that are related to the individual themselves. Number 1, Islam. Now this might seem obvious, but the jurist mentioned it just to highlight, the importance that zakah is only an obligation upon Muslims. It's not obligatory upon non-Muslims because it is an act of worship. And this is actually an important point for us to understand. Zakah is not a tax. Oftentimes people make this comparison, they make this analogy that zakah is basically the tax for being a Muslim. That is not the correct way of understanding it. That's not the correct way of looking at it. Zakah is not a tax. Zakah is ibadah. It is an act of worship. And that is why only the Muslims are obligated to pay it. Because acts of worship, ibadat, are specific to people of faith and belief and iman. Number 2, al-bulugh. They have to be an adult. The second condition related to the individual is being an adult. So zakah is not obligatory upon minors, even if they have wealth. And this is specific to the Hanafi school of thought. Right? So zakah is only due upon adults, people who have passed the age of puberty. Zakah is not an obligation upon minors, upon children, even though they may have wealth. And this is based on a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said the pen has been lifted from 3. Right? رُفِعَ الْقَلَمُ عَنْ ثَلَاثٍ. The pen meaning obligation, taklif, right? Being legally responsible in front of God, has been lifted from 3 people. Number 1, a person who's sleeping until they wake up. Number 2, a child until they become an adult. And number 3, a person who is insane until they become sane. And the reasoning behind this is that all acts of worship require the power of choice, require ikhtiyar, and it requires accountability. So again, when it comes to the individual, the first is they gotta be Muslim. The second, they have to be an adult. The third, they have to be sane. All right, there is no zakah obligatory on the wealth of a person who is not sane. And this refers to a person who has reached the age of puberty in the state of insanity, as well as those who are afflicted by temporary insanity, and it continues for a whole year, and they're excused from the obligation of zakah because of that same hadith of Ali radiallahu anhu that I just mentioned. Now, the technical term in the Arabic language for an individual who is adult and sane, aqil and baligh, is called mukallaf. Right? The technical term in the Arabic language for any individual who is both an adult and sane is called mukallaf. And what that means is that they are legally responsible in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. that all of their deeds, all of their actions are being recorded, and they will be held accountable for it. So all of the obligations now become binding upon them. All of the prohibitions become binding upon them. And they have to try their best to obey the commandments of Allah and stay away from His prohibitions. The fourth is freedom. And this is mentioned in the classical books of fiqh. It's not really applicable in the modern era, so we don't really need to worry about it. But historically speaking, zakah was not an obligation upon slaves. And number 5 is not being in debt. Not being in debt. Now, zakah is not obligatory upon a person whose debts are more than their assets. So zakah is not an obligation upon an individual whose debts are more than their assets. Meaning, if a person's wealth is equal to or less than their debt, then no zakah is due from them. But if their wealth exceeds their debt, right? They have wealth, but they're also in debt. But their wealth exceeds their debt, right? They will pay zakah on the excess as long as that excess amount is more than nisab. So for example, I have $100,000 in cash, right? Those are my assets. I own them straight up, clean and clear. I own $100,000. But I also have a loan of $50,000 that I took from my friend. I'm in debt. I owe him $50,000. So in order to determine if I owe zakah or not, I will subtract that $50,000. And if I'm left with now $50,000 itself, and since that $50,000 is above nisab, I will pay zakah on that remainder amount. But if my debts are equal to or more than my assets, then I don't have nisab and I don't have to pay zakah. So for example, let's take a simpler one. I have $10,000 and I owe someone $15,000. That means I have nothing. I'm in the negative for $5,000. So in that scenario, I don't have to pay zakah, and actually I could be eligible to receive zakah. All right. So the fifth condition is not being in debt, but there's details to that. What it means is that your debts outweigh your assets, right? Either they're equal to or they outweigh your assets. And we'll talk about long-term debt and short-term debt, right? There's long-term debt, which would be a huge, large amount that you can pay over several years, and there's short-term debt, which is due immediately. So when it comes to long-term debts, the fatwa is that you only subtract the immediate payment. So for example, a mortgage or a car payment, that would be considered to be a long-term debt. So I'm not going to deduct the entire amount. Rather, I will deduct the immediate payment at the time when I'm paying my zakah. So for example, hypothetically, I have a car payment of $500 a month, right? So when I'm paying my zakah, I can subtract that $500. I will not subtract the entire amount, which let's say is $20,000. But if it's a short-term debt, if it's something that's due immediately, right, within the year or within a few months, then I can subtract the entire amount. But we'll get into more details of that when we get to that section. So again, there are 5 conditions that are related to the individual when it comes to the obligation of zakah. Number 1, Islam. Number 2, they have to be an adult. Number 3, they got to be sane. Number 4, they have to be free. And number 5, they have to not be in debt. So these are the 5 conditions that are related to an individual. So if an individual fulfills these 5 conditions, then zakah will become obligatory upon them. And if any of these conditions are missing, then zakah will not be an obligation upon them. Now, for those of you who want to ask questions, you can put your questions in the comments. And when we take a little break, I will go through and I will look at the questions and I will try my best to answer them, inshallah. So let's finish the conditions. And then after the conditions, we'll take a short break where I'll try to answer any questions that might have come up. And then we'll carry on. All right, the second set of conditions are those that are related to the wealth. Meaning, which assets that I own are actually subject to zakah. So there are 6 conditions that are related to the wealth itself. Number 1 is ownership. Right? The first condition is ownership. Zakah is only due on certain types of assets that are completely owned by the individual. There is no zakah on anything that is not owned by an individual. So for example, if someone has given me money to hold for them, as an amana, They deposit some wealth with me. Like they deposited, $10,000 with me because they trust me. I do not have to pay zakah on that because I am not the owner. I'm just holding it as an amana, as a trust. I have to give it back to that person. Right? Same thing for loans. Right? When I take a loan for someone, they give me $10,000. That's not my money. I don't own it. So I do not have to pay zakah on it. Number two is not only do you own the actual asset, meaning you have ownership of it, but you also have the ability to use it. And this is a very important one to understand because several issues are built off of this. So not only do I own the asset completely, but I also have the ability to use it. So not only does that wealth or asset have to be owned, but one also must have possession of it so that they're able to use it. So this condition goes back to possession. There's potential to benefit from the wealth through growth or transaction. And the scholars, they mention that there's two types of possession. There's physical possession, where something is actually in hand. I have direct access to it. And then there's constructive possession, which means that I might not have direct access to it, but I can access it very easily. So for example, if I own a business, right, and I got a bookstore. So I might have books in my store that I have direct access to, but I might also have some stock that's sitting in a warehouse somewhere. So although I don't have direct access to it, I can still go and easily get it because I own it and I have access to that warehouse and I can go get the books. So regardless of how the item is possessed, whether it's physical possession or it's constructive possession, if I have access to that wealth and I own it, it's subject to zakah. So if I own an asset and I have access to it, that asset will be zakatable. All right. For example, and these are examples that are mentioned in the classical books of fiqh, and we'll mention some more modern examples as well. But for example, lost property. All right. If there's some lost property or those debts that are denied by the borrower are exempt from zakah. So for example, I loaned $10,000 to my best friend and he denies it. I don't know how good of a friend that would be, but let's just say hypothetically, right? I loaned $10,000 to my friend and he's denying it. Now those $10,000, those are mine. I own it. And I technically had access to it because when it comes to a loan, I can demand repayment whenever I want. But now that person is denying it. He's saying, no, you never gave me $10,000. So I don't have access to that money. And because I don't have access to it, it won't be subject to zakah. Or lost property. Someone, mashallah, had let's say a brick of gold. And they were worried about where to keep it, so they buried it somewhere in the desert. And then they completely forgot where they buried it. They have no clue where it is. Right? They might own that, but they don't have access to it. They have no idea where it is. So it will not be subject to zakah. Right? That is a more classical example. A more modern example may be 401ks, right? Your retirement fund, or a Roth IRA, or any type of IRA. That money that you invest into that fund, that's your money. You own it. And whatever your employer might match, once it becomes vested, you own that as well. Right? So you have ownership, and you also have access to it. Although the access to it might have some obstructions there, right? There might be some preventions to that because there's heavy taxes and there's heavy penalties for withdrawing early. But because you own that money and because you have access to it, it is subject to zakah. And we'll talk about that later on. And we'll talk about how to calculate how much you owe from your retirement fund or whatever else it may be. All right, so number one, you own the money. Number two, you have the ability to use that money, meaning you have access to it. Right? Number three is growth. That zakah is only due on those assets that have the potential to grow and increase. So zakah is not due on every single type of wealth that I own. It is only due on those assets that have the potential to grow and increase. So wealth can have real growth. Wealth can have real growth, meaning it actually grows, like agriculture products, like fruit and trees, whatever. Or it can be kept for growth, like animals that you have for grazing or merchandise. Or it has intrinsic value, like gold, silver, and cash. Right? It's like بِخِلْقَتِهِ, intrinsically it carries value. So that is why not all of the items or assets we own are subject to zakah. Only those that have the potential of growth, whether it's real or not. And based off these conditions, and we'll mention these specifically, there's only 5 types of wealth that are subject to zakah. Number 1, merchandise. If I own a business, any item that I have purchased with the intention of resale, that is subject to zakah. Why? Because it has the potential for growth. Number 2, gold, silver, cash, because they carry intrinsic value. Right. Number 3, agricultural products, because they can grow. Number 4, livestock, because it can grow. And people usually separate between gold and silver and cash, so they're 2 separate categories. But those are the types of assets that are subject to zakah. And again, we'll talk about those in detail later on. All right, so 3 conditions so far related to wealth. Ownership, I own the asset. Number 2, I have access to it, right? I can use it. Number 3, the potential of growth. Number 4, that wealth that we have is in excess of our basic necessities. So a person's basic personal needs are exempt from zakah. And this refers to personal items such as the house that you live in, right? Furniture that you use, clothing that you wear, the vehicles that you use to drive, any equipment that you use for your profession, or any other personal belongings like books. So the scholars, to make things easy, the jurists, the fuqaha, what they mean by basic personal necessities is the following. Any item that is purchased for personal use. Any item that is purchased for personal use without the intention of resale. So anything that I may buy for my own personal use and I do not have the intention to resell it will not be subject to zakah. That will be classified as your basic necessity. And hawa'ijul asliyah. Although you may not really need it and you might just have it because you want it, but if it's a personal item that is not meant for resale, it is not subject to zakah. All right. For example, people might, collect certain items. All right. People might collect stamps. They might collect, figurines. They might collect shoes. So if a person has a very expensive shoe collection and they bought it without the intention of reselling it, all right, they're just buying it as a collection, that will not be subject to zakah. All right. Number 5 is passing of a year, right? Passing of a year. So the assets or items subject to zakah must be in the ownership of the individual for 1 lunar year, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, there is no zakah on wealth until a lunar year has passed on it. Now, what this means is that you have to have the nisab at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year. Meaning you have that minimum amount which makes zakah obligatory upon you at the beginning of the year as well as the end of the year. Whatever happens in between doesn't matter. So for example, if I start this year with $5,000, or let's say I started last Ramadan, right? Last Ramadan, I had $5,000. And then this Ramadan, I'm going to pay zakah again. So that $5,000 throughout the year, it obviously didn't stay constant. It fluctuated. So perhaps, it went up to 10,000, it dipped down to 4,000, it went to 6,000, went to 20,000, came back to 15,000, and now it's Ramadan and I'm back at only 10,000. I will pay zakah, right, 2.5% of that 10,000. Whatever happened in between the year does not matter. So although this is a condition, because zakah is only due once a year, and that the lunar year has to pass on the asset that you own, it is impossible. It is very difficult to track that for every single dollar you earn. Right? It's very difficult to track that for every single item you purchase for resale, or whatever else it may be. So taysiran, to make things easy, they say you just look at the beginning of the year and you look at the end of the year. Whatever happens in between does not matter. And that is what is meant by hawlanul hawl, the passage of a year. The only exception to this is if you go completely bankrupt, that you go down to 0 or below 0. Then you'll restart calculating your year once you reach nisab again. Right? So for example, I have $5,000 right now, and then 2 months down the line, I lose everything I own. I go bankrupt. I'm at 0. So at that moment, I don't have to pay zakah. And then as soon as I get the nisab again, I will start calculating my year. So the 5th condition is passing of the year. And the last condition is nisab. Right? The last condition is nisab. In order for zakah to be obligatory on an individual, they have to own the nisab. And nisab is the minimum amount of wealth that makes zakah obligatory. Right? Nisab is the minimum amount of wealth that makes zakah obligatory upon a person. This is the minimum amount of wealth required for a person to be considered wealthy. If I own this much money, then in the eyes of the Sharia, I am considered to be a wealthy individual. And if a person owns less than the nisab, then they are not considered to be wealthy. So regarding this concept, Shah Waliullah al-Dahlawi rahimahullah, a very famous Indian scholar, a muhaddith, a reformer, a theologian, a philosopher, he passed away in the year 1762. He wrote the following, right? Nisab on silver was estimated at 200 dirhams. The Prophet ﷺ, he established the nisab of silver as 200 dirhams, and we'll talk about what that means. Because that was sufficient for the smallest household to live on for 1 year under reasonable prices and with average dietary habits. So if a person owned the nisab, that means they could live their life fairly comfortably. Right? If a person owned nisab, that meant in the eyes of the Sharia, they were considered to be wealthy. So what is the nisab? It's the bare minimum amount of wealth that makes zakah obligatory upon an individual. And since this is such an important concept, we are going to discuss this in some detail right now. All right, let's talk about the nisab in detail. And after I finish my discussion on nisab, I will go through the comments and answer any questions that have come up so far. All right, so the system of nisab was set so that the obligation of zakah would be fair to the rich and the poor. All right, the hikmah, the wisdom behind establishing this bare minimum amount of wealth was so that zakah as an act of worship would be fair, would be balanced to both the rich and the poor. So Shah Waliullah, again, he writes, the need was felt for fixing the rate of zakah. For, were it not done, there was a danger of irregularity and confusion in its observance. Everyone would have followed their own rules and regulations. It should neither be so negligible that its effect is not felt, and therefore fails to serve as a corrective to miserliness, nor so high as to be unbearable. The same is the case with the time of its payment and the period covered by it. It should neither be so short as to necessitate the payment of zakah every now and then, nor so long as to give a holiday or to misers, and at the same time provide no relief to the poor. So what is the nisab? The Prophet ﷺ specified the nisab in terms of both gold and silver. Right? The Prophet ﷺ himself, he specifically mentioned and highlighted what the nisab is, both in terms of gold and silver. So during the life of the Prophet ﷺ, 1400 plus years ago, the world was a very, very different place. Right? This is before modernity, the pre-modern era. So trade, commerce, buying and selling, economics was very, very different than what it is today. So we're talking about the time before centralized governments, right? Before banks existed, before formalized currencies. So the most common commodities that people used to trade in were dates, salt, wheat, barley, gold, and silver. Right? Most likely the most common way of trading was the barter system. People would exchange commodities for commodities. However, gold and silver coins did exist. They weren't like formalized currencies, but they existed. A gold coin during the time of the Prophet ﷺ was called a dinar. Right? The word dinar during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and even in the early classical period, it is a gold coin of a specific weight. And the silver coin was called the dirham. Right? So the gold coin was called a dinar, the silver coin was called a dirham, which was a coin of a specific weight. So the Prophet ﷺ, he clarified the nisab for both gold and silver. So the Prophet ﷺ said the nisab of gold is 20 dinars. Right? The nisab of gold is 20 dinars. So 20 gold coins of a specific weight. And the jurists, they went and calculated it, and it's about 87.48 grams of gold. So the nisab of gold is 87.48 grams of gold. Ali radiallahu anhu narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, nothing is incumbent upon you until you have 20 dinars. When you have 20 dinars and a year has passed on it, then what is due is half of a dinar, 2.5%. Then whatever increases, it will be according to that. there is no zakah on any wealth until a year passes over it. So that's the nisab of gold, 20 dinars, which is 87.48 grams of gold. Then the Prophet ﷺ also identified the nisab of silver as 200 dirhams, right? 200 silver coins of a specific weight, which comes out to 612.36 grams of silver, right? 612.36 grams of silver. Ali radiallahu anhu narrates that the Prophet ﷺ said, offer zakah of silver, 1 dirham from every 40, meaning 2.5%. There is nothing in 190 dirhams. When they reach 200, then in them are 5 dirhams. So again, the Prophet ﷺ, he is highlighting that the nisab of gold, 20 dinars. So during the life of the Prophet ﷺ, if someone owned 20 dinars or more, they had the nisab. And if a year passed over it, they would give 2.5%. If a person had 200 silver coins, 200 dirhams, and a year passed over it, they would give 2.5%. So in the modern era, in terms of grams, it's 87.48 grams of gold and 612.36 grams of silver. Now, historically speaking, gold and silver have always held intrinsic value. This is like from the beginning of mankind. Gold and silver by nature, they hold intrinsic value and have been used for the purpose of trade. Before the advent of paper currency, people would trade using gold and silver coins, and over hundreds of years, paper currency replaced the usage of gold and silver coins, although these two precious metals back the value of the currency. So in history, right, people use gold and silver coins, then eventually they started making paper currency. But that paper currency, it was backed by the value of gold or even silver. So they say the silver standard, which evaluates the dollar based on the value of silver, it lost support in the late 19th century. And the US, right, currently here in the US, we stopped using the gold standard in 1933. Thereafter ending any connection of the dollar with gold in 1971. So since 1971, right, almost 50 years ago, the currency that we have, those dollars, they're not connected to gold or silver. It's just a piece of paper. But that piece of paper is assigned value because we assign it value based off of economics and all that fun stuff. Right? So the US dollar converted to what we call a fiat currency. Right? A fiat currency is a legal tender by government decree with no precious metal or asset backing its value. So this change to the fiat system, it raised a question for the scholars of Islam. Right? It raises a question for the jurists. How does one calculate the nisab of money? How does one calculate the nisab of cash for the purposes of paying zakah, which is one of the core pillars of Islam? Do we quantify it against the gold nisab, or do we quantify it against the silver nisab? Which level do we use? Do we use the value of 612.36 grams of silver or 87.48 grams of gold? So in simpler words, which standard do we use to determine the nisab? Gold or silver? So evidently, the nisab of gold did not differ significantly from the nisab of silver during the time of the jurists, similar to the prophetic era. But the value of both items today is very, very different. So for example, I checked on Wednesday, gold was $55.67 a gram. Gold was $55.67 per gram. So if you multiply that by 87.48, we get $4,870. So if a person has $4,870 or more, they have the nisab, and they're obligated to pay zakah. So if they have $4,800 or $4,870 now, and at the end of the year they have that much or more, they have to pay zakah. That's the gold standard. Silver, on the other hand, is super cheap. Silver was only 50 cents a gram. So 50 cents times 612.36 comes out to $306.18. So there's a huge disparity. There's a huge disparity between the value of gold and the value of silver. So previously, the nisab of silver could suffice a family of 3 for a full year. Right? That's what Shah Waliullah wrote, that the nisab of silver could suffice a family of 3 for a whole year. But nowadays, a single individual, right? I myself would find it very difficult on surviving independently on the nisab of silver for even 1 week, right? $300 goes away like that. Even the nisab of silver, right? 4,870, that might be enough for 1 month for a household. So when it comes to determining, right? When it comes to determining which value we should use, right? Which value you should use for determining zakah, we say that you should use the value of gold. Right? So to summarize, historically speaking, the value for the nisab of silver was close to the value for the nisab of gold, but as time went on, gold held on to its value, whereas the value of silver dropped dramatically. So that is why most contemporary scholars are of the opinion, including all of us here at IOK, that the gold standard should be used for determining the nisab. So to make this entire discussion, the reason why I went into all this is to give details. Right? We as Muslims should practice our faith, our deen, built upon solid knowledge and understanding. But for the sake of super simplicity, to keep it super simple, if you own $4,870 or more, that means you meet the nisab. That means zakah is now an obligation upon you. You're going to start counting your year. If a year later, you still own $4,870 or more, then you will give 2.5% of that in zakah. Right? That is the nisab. So we'll use the gold standard, which is 87.48 grams of gold, or its monetary value. So the monetary value of that on Wednesday was $4,870. So if I own that right now, 1 year later, I still own that much or more, I give zakah, 2.5%. Whatever happened in between, increase, decrease, does not matter. So if I own $4,870 or more in excess of my basic personal needs and a year passes over it, I will pay 2.5%. So these are the 6 conditions related to wealth. All right, number 1, you own it. Number 2, you have the ability to use it. Number 3, it has the potential to grow. Number 4, it's in excess of our basic necessities. Number 5, a year passes over it. And number 6, it's the nisab. All right, it is the nisab. All right, so what we'll do is we'll take a short break here so I can go through the comments and answer people's questions really quickly. And then we will move on to which commodities are zakatable and how do we, in the modern era, calculate how much zakah we owe. All right, so let's see. One question, does debt mean house mortgage? So your mortgage, right? If you have a mortgage, that is a debt, because that's money you own to the bank. Hopefully it's an Islamic, Sharia compliant mortgage. If not, it's okay. That's just like, it's still a debt that you owe someone. So yes, that counts as a debt. But since it's a long-term debt, right? Most mortgages are 15 years or 30 years. Since it's a long-term debt, you will not deduct the entire amount. You will only deduct the current payment. So for example, let's say I have a 15-year mortgage on my house. I owe the bank $400,000. Right? If I subtract that entire $400,000, not only am I not paying zakah, I'm going to be receiving zakah. So I will just deduct the current payment of when I pay my zakah. So if I'm paying zakah in the month of Ramadan, I can deduct the mortgage payment, which might be like $2,000. That would be fine. Right? Same thing for a car loan. If I have financed my car for 5 years, I don't deduct the entire amount. I will only deduct the current payment. All right. Let's see. I have a building for my business with mortgage, and I have excess money. Do I have to pay zakah on the excess? I could use it to reduce the mortgage and pay less zakah. All right. So if you own a building for your business with a mortgage, it depends on whose name that mortgage is in. Is it in the business's name or is it in your name? And if you have excess money, do I have to pay zakah on the excess? If you have it still, yes, you pay zakah on it. And if you then use that to pay off the mortgage of the building, that's a different story. Then you won't own that money anymore. Someone asked about 401k funds. Yes, we say that you have to pay zakah on your 401k. Why? Because you own that money. And number 2, you have access to it. Now your access to it is limited because of the penalties and taxes. So the fatwa that we give is you can subtract the penalties and taxes, and whatever balance you're left with, you will pay zakah on that amount. Right? So just hypothetical, this is not anything accurate. say you have $100,000 in your 401k account right now. And if you were to withdraw at this moment, if you were to withdraw right now, the taxes and penalties would be like, let's just say $30,000. So 100,000 minus 30,000 is 70. So you would pay zakah on the $70,000, right? You would not. You can subtract the penalties and the taxes. All right. A loan you give for the 2 to 3 years with monthly payments. Do I pay zakat? Yes. So if you give a loan to someone, that money is yours. Right? If I loan someone money, that money is actually mine. I own it. And I technically have access to it because I can ask for it back whenever I want. So any money that I loan to someone is subject to zakah. But to make things easier, they say you don't have to pay zakah on it until you get it back. I don't have to pay zakah on the money I'm owed until I actually get it back. But when I get it back, I have to pay zakah on all the previous years as well, all the past years as well. So let's say I loan someone $20,000 and they're going to pay me back after 3 years. So one way I could do it is I could pay zakah on that $20,000 every year until I get it back, which is easy, simple. Or I can wait those 3 years. And once I get the $20,000 back, I'll pay zakah on it, but I'll have to pay for the back years as well. All right, so you have options there. You have options there. Should zakah always be given locally, or can it be given to the needy overseas abroad, where it might be more beneficial? We're going to talk about that in detail, but it is preferred to give it locally. All right, one of the objectives of zakah is that so the poor and needy of your own community can get some access to wealth. All right, that is one of the objectives of zakah. But if there are people that are perhaps your relatives somewhere else in a different locality, in a different country, then giving zakah to them might be better if they're deserving of it, because by doing so, not only are you paying your zakah, but you're also maintaining the ties of kinship. Or if there's an emergency need somewhere else where they need the money way more than it's needed here, then you can also give it abroad. But it's recommended, it is better to give your zakah locally. How much is the nisab today? The nisab is, again, it's 87.48 grams of gold. It's monetary value. So the monetary value can fluctuate. It can even fluctuate daily. When I checked on Wednesday, gold was, again, it was $55.67 a gram. So based on that, the nisab was $4,870. Any item for personal use with no intention to resell, does that mean that all the gold I have, regardless of the quantity, is for my personal use? No. So this is a good question, and we're actually going to get to that. According to the Hanafi school of thought, any gold or silver you own, regardless of what the purpose is, if it's for personal use, if it's decoration, if it's just a keep, whatever, you got to give zakah on it. Because gold and silver carry intrinsic value. But that is specific to the Hanafi school of thought. And we'll talk about that in detail in the next section, inshallah. If someone buys gold jewelry with the intention of strictly giving gift to family, will that be liable for zakah? No, because your intention was to give it as a gift. So once you give it as a gift, you don't own it anymore. Right? You don't own it anymore. Now, most people nowadays are not business people with a lot of assets. Almost everything we buy, house, cars, furniture, are for personal use. Does that mean in that case, we would only pay zakah in cash? Yes. So anything that you own in terms of your house, your car, your furniture, all of that counts as basic personal necessities. So anything you purchase for personal use without the intention of resale, that is excluded from being zakatable. The only thing that's zakatable then would be your cash on hand, right? Your actual zakatable assets would be your cash, your stocks, your retirement account, etc. And we'll talk about that. That is the next section. Can you please elaborate on who is considered Hashimi? And if you know someone who is considered that, what are the requirements of paying them? If someone is Hashimi, meaning they claim to be from the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ, from his family, and they identify, some of his uncles and stuff like that, then they would not be eligible to receive zakah, according to the majority. They cannot receive zakah. You mentioned that the nisab was used to support a household of 3 for a year. Why does Islam not reflect that number in the modern day? Very good question. So when it comes to acts of worship, what happens is that we get restricted to what the Prophet ﷺ says. Right? That might have been the objective, that might have been the wisdom behind it. But when it comes to specific numbers and specifics of the details, then we have to go with what the text of the Quran or Sunnah say. So for example, when it comes to praying Salatul Fajr, it's only 2 rak'ahs. Right? I can't come and say that, praying 4 is better than 2, why don't I just pray 4 rak'ahs? Or praying 1 is easier than praying 2, I'll just pray 1. When it comes to acts of worship, when it comes to something that's ta'abbudi, when it's like a devotional act of worship, you got to stick with what the text say, which is either the Quran or the authentic statements of the Prophet ﷺ. So since the nisab was directly specified by the Prophet ﷺ, we're going to stick with that. So the specific nisab for gold is that 20 dinars, 87.48 grams, and the nisab for silver was specific at 612.36 grams. If a student has a part-time job and has more money than basic needs, such as their tuition, but still spends their money on non-necessities, such as food, clothes, etc. I can't see. Okay, we'll answer that, inshallah. All right. I have inventory. Yes, you pay zakah on your inventory. If you have a business, any inventory that you have is subject to zakah, and you will pay that on the. Well, all this is coming up, so just hold on. What about investment properties? Investment properties, it depends on how it's invested. Right, it really depends on how it is, and we'll talk about that in detail as well. Are women liable to pay zakah even though they don't generate any income? If they own nisab, yes. Women, if they own nisab, which again is $4,870 or more, and a year passes over it, then they are individually obligated to pay zakah. Now, their husbands, through the kindness of their hearts and for husn al-mu'asharat, to make things good, they can pay on their behalf as well. But it is an individual obligation. All right, good. So far, just to recap, what we've discussed so far is the definition of zakah, linguistically and technically. We talked about the conditions related to the individual, and then we talked about the conditions related to the wealth. Now, what type of wealth that we own, right? Which assets that we own are actually subject to zakah? All right, which assets are zakatable? So this is a very important section, and it will clarify a lot of people's questions. So first and foremost, it is not necessary to pay zakah on every single thing that we own. It is not necessary to pay zakah on every single asset that we own. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, a person's basic personal needs and necessities are exempted. So this refers to personal items, such as the house that we live in, right? The furniture that we use, or perhaps we don't even use, right? Clothing, vehicles, shoes, equipment used for one's profession, or any other personal belongings like books. So the way we understand a personal need, and if you understand this definition, then you yourself can determine what is exempt from zakah. Any item that I purchase for personal use without the intention of resale is not subject to zakah. So that would include most of my household items. So the house itself, the cars, the furniture, the pots and pans, right? Any decorative pieces I may have. What else? Books, TVs, right? Your DVD, your Xbox, all that fun stuff. None of that is subject to zakah, right? Any item that I buy for personal use and my intention is not to resell it, then it is not subject to zakah, right? Only those assets that have the potential of growth and increase are subject to zakah, and they are classified as the following. There are five categories of assets that we have to pay zakah on. Number one, merchandise, trade goods. Now this will be specific to people who own businesses, whether it's a large business or a small business, whatever it is, your inventory, your merchandise is subject to zakah. So any non-monetary item purchased with the intention of resale is classified as merchandise. And what is meant by non-monetary is that it's not cash, right? It's not gold or silver, because that's a different category. So any non-monetary item, it's not gold, it's not silver, not cash. It's clothing, it's books, it's honey, it's food items, whatever. Any merchandise I own as part of my business, my inventory, is subject to zakah. So in simpler words, merchandise. A person should calculate the wholesale value of their merchandise and count it towards their zakatable assets. So let's say I own a small business, and my small business is that I sell books. Right? I got an online bookstore, or I have a physical bookstore, whatever it is. So my inventory, right, my stock, that is subject to zakah. How do I determine the value? You can use the wholesale value, or you can use the current market value, but you're not going to be using your resale value or the value that you bought it at. You're going to use the current market value of the merchandise or the wholesale value. Like if I was to get rid of all my inventory today, if I were to sell every single book I own in my store today, what that value would be, I would pay zakat on that. So let's just say I have a small bookstore, and if I were to liquidate everything today, if I were to sell all my inventory, I will end up with $10,000. That $10,000 would be subject to zakat. I would add that to my zakatable assets. So any small business or any business, the merchandise, the product that you're selling, right? The actual item is going to be subject to zakat. Those items that are needed for a person's business but are not merchandise are not subject to zakat. So same example, I have a bookstore. I have to pay zakat on my earnings, right? All the profit, the value, the wholesale value of my books, but I don't have to pay zakat on the furniture, the bookshelves or the chairs, or perhaps the cash register, the computer, the shop itself, etc. I'm only paying zakat on any money I earn from it, and also the wholesale value or the current market value of all of my merchandise. All right, so that is category number one, and this would be specific to people who own businesses, which might be a large segment of our Muslim community. May Allah bless all of you and bless your businesses and put barakah in them, inshaAllah. All right, number two is cash. All type of cash we own and that we have access to is subject to zakat. It doesn't matter what type of currency it is. Could be dollars, could be euros, rupees. I don't know why you'd have rupees, but if you got rupees, riyals, pounds, in your hand, in the bank account, stock, loans, whatever it is. All the cash that you own and all of the cash you have access to is subject to zakat. Right? Some people, they don't trust banks, so they keep the cash in their house, under their pillow. Right? Whatever cash you own is subject to zakat. So regardless of what form it takes, right? Whether it's in your hand, you actually have physical access to it. Whether it's in a bank account, a checking account, savings account, doesn't matter. Whether it's a stock, right? Whether your cash is tied up in stock, it's also subject to zakat. Now, when it comes to stocks, there's a little bit more detail, where people invest in stocks for either capital gain or for dividends, right? If you purchase stock with the intention of resale, right, it's considered to be a trade good. It's considered to be merchandise. So zakat is due on it every year based on its market value that year. So if the share was purchased for the purpose of capital gain, meaning one bought it with the primary intention of selling it, then zakat will be due on the market value of the share at the time one pays zakat. So that would be like most people, right? Most people, when they're investing in stocks, they're usually investing for capital gain, not dividends. So if you invest in a particular fund that's made up of various stocks, right? What do you give zakat on? The value of those stocks on the day you're paying zakat. So let's say hypothetically, I have a investment fund with a particular financial institution. Let's just say with Amana, right? Shout out to Amana. Let's just say I have a fund with them, right? And the value of that fund on the 1st of Ramadan, which is the day I'm going to pay my zakat, is $20,000. So I will add that $20,000 to my total assets, right? That is for if you purchase your stock for capital gain, right? If it's purchased not for resale, but rather to receive annual dividends, then the stock itself is not deemed an article of merchandise. Rather, one is deemed a co-owner in the company. And based on one's respective share, in that case, one pays zakat on all goods and monetary assets of the company, yet may deduct those assets that are not zakatable, company assets for use and not for sale, such as the land, machinery, cars, and like. So for example, let's say I purchased some shares of a particular company worth $100. 10% of that company's assets are in form of raw material, 10% in cash, 10% of produced goods, 10% of the assets are goods which are under processing, totaling 40%. On the other hand, the machinery, the land, furniture, and cars are 60%. So in that case, zakat will be obligatory on only 40% of the shares. Now, all of that is really complicated, and you might have to look at the annual reports and do some homework on your own. And since it's so complicated, for the sake of ease, people also just pay the zakat on the value of your share. Right? Whatever value your share is in that company, just pay zakat on that amount to make it simple, easy, straightforward. Right? So I'm getting zakat on any type of cash I have, whether it's in my hands, whether it's in a bank account, checking, savings, doesn't matter, whether it's invested in stocks. All that monetary value, all that cash value, I'm going to pay zakat on it. Now the question of retirement funds, right? Whether it's a 401k, whether it's an IRA, whatever. So based on how a 401k is structured, right, it is clear that the money invested in the fund, both by the employee and the employer, along with any gains and profit, is owned by the employee. It is owned by the individual. If I have a 401k, any part of my salary that goes into it, any match by my employer that goes into it, especially once it becomes vested, that is my money. And then whatever growth happens because of whatever fund it's in, that's also my money. So I own it, number one, right? I own it, and I also have access to it. But I mentioned again that the access is restricted, and it is subject to heavy penalties and heavy fines. So since funds cannot be withdrawn from the 401k until the age of 59 and a half without incurring taxes and penalties, zakah will not be due on it until one has unrestricted access to the money, and at that time, zakah will be owed for all of the previous years. That's option number one. So I have a 401k, right? But I don't have access to it without incurring heavy penalties and taxes. So I will get it at the age of 59 and a half. So once I receive it at 59 and a half, I will pay zakah on that amount and all the previous years as well. Now that's complicated, right? In order to keep track of that and calculate, that's too complicated. So to make it less complicated, the fatwa that most people say is just give it every year, right? Pay zakah on that fund every single year. So again, what we say is you can subtract, you can deduct your penalties and taxes. So I mentioned the example, but I'll mention it again. Currently, I have a 401k. It's worth $100,000. Right? And if I were to withdraw on the day I pay my zakah, I will incur taxes and penalties that amount to $40,000. Right? I can deduct that $40,000 from the $100,000, so I'm left with $60,000. So I will pay zakah on that $60,000. All right. The fifth is loans. Right? Money that we lend to people is still our own. Right? We own it and we have technically access to it in the sense that we can ask for it back whenever we want. So since a loan fits the conditions, it's also subject to zakah. It is also subject to zakah. Rental income is also subject to zakah. So the second category is cash. Whatever cash you have in your possession and you have access to it and you own it. So whether it's dollars, riyals, euros, rupees, doesn't matter. If it's in a bank account, checking, saving, doesn't matter. If it's a safe in your house, under your pillow, under your mattress, doesn't matter. If it's invested in stock, doesn't matter. If it's invested in some sort of fund, doesn't matter. Right? All of that will be subject to zakah. All right. The third is gold and silver. Right? Gold and silver. Now, according to the Hanafi school of thought, gold and silver, any form it takes, whether it's coins, whether it's like bars of gold and silver, raw nuggets, jewelry that you wear or you don't wear, decorative pieces, silverware, it does not matter. Any type of gold and silver you own is subject to zakah. So any type of gold or silver that a person owns is subject to zakah. And this is the Hanafi position. According to Al-Jumhur, right, according to the Malikis and the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis, zakah is not due on jewelry that you wear. Right? Zakah is not due on jewelry that is worn. But the details for that, there's a little bit more, like how often do you wear it, etc. There's some extra details. That is the opinion of the Jumhur. But the opinion of the Hanafis is it doesn't matter. If you wear the jewelry, you don't wear it. If you have it for the sake of just keeping it or not. Regardless of what form gold and silver takes, you pay zakah on it. And based off of our research and the dalil, the argument for that is quite strong. And that is what we suggest to everyone. That whatever gold and silver jewelry they have, they should pay zakah on it. But it is a legitimate difference of opinion that exists. And both positions are valid. And qualified scholars reserve the right to hold whichever opinion they feel is stronger. The average person, for you personally, what should you do? Should you pay zakah on your jewelry or not? You should follow the opinion of your personal school of thought, if you have one, or a local scholar or imam whose knowledge and piety you trust. So whoever your local scholar is, whoever you trust, whoever you think is pious, follow what they tell you. So we at IOK say yes, gold and silver jewelry, subject to zakah. Right? There is no zakah on precious stones. So pearls, right, rubies, diamonds, sapphire, none of that is subject to zakah unless it's merchandise, unless you purchased it with the intention of resale. All right, number 4 is livestock. It's a very specific type of livestock, camels, cows, and sheep that are meant for grazing. And since most of us do not live in a rural area, nor do we own a farm, and nor do we have like some, mashallah, pastures that we graze our animals in, we don't have to discuss this. But livestock that a person owns, that is owned for the purpose of grazing, is subject to zakat, and it has specific nisab as well. For example, if a person owns 5 camels, then they have to give, a sheep away in zakat. But that's a whole separate thing. We don't need to discuss that. And the last one is agricultural output. Right. The last one is agricultural output. And since again we don't own farms and we don't really have produce, we don't have to worry about that. All right. So the basic principle when looking at things that are zakatable are that they should be of monetary value, meaning cash, silver, gold, and items for trade and sale. So if we look at the screen right now, right, if you look at the slide, most people only have merchandise, cash, gold, and silver. So the way we would calculate our zakah is we would add up all of our assets together. So I'm going to add up all of my merchandise. If I own a small business, if I own a business, I'm going to determine the value of my merchandise. Then I'm going to determine the value of all of my cash. Then I'm going to determine the value of my gold and silver. I will add all of that up and I'll come up with a total number. From that number, I can deduct any liabilities I may have. Whether it's a loan I owe someone, a debt I owe someone, whatever it may be. I will subtract those liabilities. The final number I get up with, I'm going to give 2.5% away of that in zakah. So if one owns several types of wealth, if one owns several types of assets, such as gold, silver, cash, merchandise, stocks, the retirement fund, right, then all of them will be added together and zakah will be paid if the value of all combined assets reaches the nisab. And since nobody, or at least I'm fairly assuming this, that the vast majority of us don't own livestock or agriculture, all we need to take into account when calculating zakah is the amount of cash we have, the value of gold and silver that we have, and the value of our merchandise that we have in our business. So we'll add all those things up, deduct the liabilities, and whatever the final number is, we will give 2.5% away of that in zakah. So there are all these tools online. There are all these zakah calculators online that help you determine how much zakah you owe. So, all of these relief organizations, whether it's Islamic Relief, whether it's ICNA Relief, whether it's Uplift, IOK, we all have these zakah calculators. And these are not necessarily 100% accurate, but they're great tools to help you determine how much zakah you owe. Right? These are great tools that you can use to determine how much zakah you use, and it really simplifies the process. And a lot of time people get caught up in the minutiae, they get caught up in the details and they get confused. Don't make zakah overcomplicated. Zakah is not as complicated as people make it out to be. It's fairly simple, fairly straightforward. So just as an example, let's go through the calculator that we have on our website and just do a hypothetical calculation of zakah. If I can get this opened. All right, good. So we have one section here for all of your assets. Then there's a section for all of your liabilities, and it does the calculation and we can determine it. So cash on hand, right? What we mean in this section by cash on hand is any cash that you actually have, for example, in your pocket, right, in your wallet that you have direct access to in your home. So let's just say, mashallah, I have, hypothetically speaking, $1,000 of cash on hand, right? At home, in my wallet, sitting in the drawers, whatever, I have $1,000 of cash, right? Secondly, the balance held in bank accounts, whether it's checking, saving, whatever type of account it may be. So let's just say if I look at my checkings account because I don't want to have a savings account because I don't want to accrue interest. Important point, I make sure that we avoid interest as much as possible. I have a checking account, and in my checking account, I have, let's just say $20,000. All right. Then I have investments in stocks. Right. I have investment in stocks or a mutual fund. So I will look at the value of those stocks. So let's just say I owe zakat today, and I open up my brokerage account. I go to my Charles Schwab account, and I look at it, and in my fund I have let's just say $10,000. Right, retirement plan. I have $100,000 in my 401k, but I'm going to subtract any penalties and taxes I may incur. So let's just say after subtracting taxes and penalties, I'm left with $40,000. Right, business inventory. If I own a business, I'm going to look at the wholesale value of my merchandise, of my commodities that I own, that I'm going to resell. So let's just say it comes out to $5,000. Rental income. If you own properties, but they're on rent, right? You are not paying zakah on the property itself. Rather, you're going to pay zakah on the rental income. So if I own multiple homes, and the purpose for me owning these homes is as an investment, that these are homes that I own, and it's an investment, I'm going to receive rental income, I only pay zakah on the rental income, not the property value itself. Same thing for apartments. I own several apartments. I own a whole apartment building. As an investment, for the sake of earning profit, I will only pay on the income I receive, not the actual building, not the land itself. So let's just say I own, mashallah, a house that I put out on rent, and I get $1,000 from it in rental income. If only in SoCal, right? Gold and silver. I have gold coins and gold chains that I don't wear, and I have them saved up, right? I have some silver coins. I determine the value, the weight, and I figure out the value comes out to, let's just say, $5,000. Right? I had given a loan to my friend of $1,000. Right? Other income that I might have gotten. So my grand total of my assets right now is $82,000. Right? My grand total of assets that is subject to zakah is $83,000. Now I can subtract my liabilities. Right? So whatever debts I owe. So whether it's a short-term loan or if it's a long-term loan, the immediate payment. So I'm going to take away, most commonly people have payments for their car and home. So let's just say the home, the mortgage is $2,000, and let's say the car is $2,500 or $500. So that's $2,500. Expenses for that month, right? Gas, electricity, other utilities, your cell phone, your internet, whatever it is. Let's just say all that comes out to about $1,000. Right? Maybe you have to pay your employees, right? Whatever that amount may be, you can subtract that as well. So I am left with a grand total of $79,500. That's zakatable. Right? I added up all my assets. I subtracted all my liabilities. I'm left with $79,500. So I will give 2.5% away of that in zakah. I will give 2.5% away of that in zakah, which is going to be $1,987.50. So as you can see, the amount of zakah that we actually give is not too much. It's not meant to be a financial burden. Right? 2.5% is a very small fraction of all the assets you own. And again, one of the purposes of this is to prevent us from hoarding money. There's no need for us to be holding on to more money than we actually need to support ourselves and support our families. That money should be circulating and should be distributed within the community. And Islam makes it an obligation to do so at least once a year. Obligation, that's the fard, that's the minimum we have to do. 2.5% of all the zakatable assets that we own. So these tools are very useful, they're very helpful. You can use them, inshallah, and it will help you determine how much zakah you owe. Alright, so let's take a short break and I will go through the comments and answer questions before we move on. Let me go up. If a woman owns investment properties, okay, so if you own an investment property, right, you have invested in a house, you have invested in a apartment or whatever, or a piece of land, then you will not pay zakah on the value of the property itself. You will pay zakah on the income you receive from it. So if I have invested in a property to receive rental income, whatever rental income I receive, I pay zakah on that. Or if I'm going to get some sort of profit from it, I invest in something to receive profit, I will pay on the profit I receive. All right, I hope that clarifies. What if one does not want to deduct mortgage payment or car loan payment? You don't have to pay it. You don't have to deduct. If you don't want to deduct, don't. You just end up paying more zakah, which is beneficial for the fuqara and the poor and needy. So you do not have to deduct. If you do not want to, you do not have to. All right, real estate, investment properties, house, condos, any difference between men and women? No, no difference. All right, everybody is an individual as responsible to pay their own zakah. If you're an adult, you're sane, you're a Muslim, you own the nisab, right, and you have zakatable assets, it is an individual obligation, individual responsibility. Is a website which generates income as a marketplace, facilities, transaction, or collection revenue, and owns merchandise zakatable? If you own a website, that is a great question. Right? It's a website which generates income as a marketplace, facilitates transactions, or collects ad revenue. So I would say that whatever revenue you earn from that website would be subject to zakah, not the website itself. So if it's just like a marketplace that you've created, let's just say for halal products, and you are just facilitating, you don't own any of that merchandise. It's like you have third-party sellers on there offering their products for sale. So whatever income you generate from that site, whether it's through ad revenue or whether people are paying you a subscription fee to be part of that marketplace, you will pay whatever zakah on whatever you earn, the income you earn from the site, not the site itself. Good question. I have heard that one does not pay on their retirement accounts because they don't have easy access to that money because of all the fees restrictions. So that is an opinion that exists. Right? That is an opinion that exists. But here at IOK, we don't necessarily agree with that opinion. And the reason why we don't agree is because your retirement account, the money in it, you own it. You own it straight up. That's your money. And second, you do have access to it. Although it's restricted access, you still have access to it. And if needed, you could use it and you can benefit from it. So because of that, it's subject to zakah. But again, to remove haraj and remove any unnecessary harms, you can subtract penalties, you can subtract your taxes. If my business generates income for me without owning any inventory, like drop shipping, and the business operation is only a website, is the website which brings value exempt from zakah? Yeah, so the website is exempt. You will only pay zakah on the income you earn from it. Or you would only pay zakah on the income that you get from the website, not the website itself. If investment properties are vacant, then I suppose no zakah? Yes. Right? If the investment property is vacant and no one's renting it out, there's no zakah. There's no zakah on the property itself, the land itself. It's only on the income from it. Good question. Rent for the whole year or month? Rent for the month, the immediate payment. You can deduct the immediate payment. If the rent we receive from rental property is not being saved, it is used to pay mortgage of current property? No. So again, that's why you would calculate everything. If your rental income is going straight to pay for your mortgage or whatever else it may be, then that's not money you have in hand. You're only paying zakah on the assets you have in hand on the day you're paying your zakah. So like we went through that sample calculation, you would calculate all that, and then you would determine it. So rental income or monthly expenses, yes. The monthly amount, yeah. So I put the monthly amount because that's what you have at hand. So you're paying zakah on what you have in hand right now, not what you're going to be receiving. Let's say calculations in wealth, stocks and jewelry goes to 2 million. That means he's liable to pay 50,000, but the access to fund is tied in the stocks and jewelry. Does he need to sell the stocks to give zakah? So if you have to sell to give zakah, you should, because that is an obligation. If you decide not to and you don't have that much liquid cash on hand, then you should record it. And that's a debt that you owe. So let's say, for example, it is a really large amount. You're a really wealthy individual, mashallah, Allah has blessed you with a lot of wealth, and your zakah comes out to like $50,000, but you don't have that much liquid assets available, then you should sell some and you should liquidate something to give that zakah. If you're unable to do so, make sure you record it and write it down that I owe this $50,000 of zakah still. So then whenever you have the ability, you would pay it. Right? So and you should try to have the ability as soon as possible. And if not, then you should record it, and it should be part of your bequest and your will as well. Right? It should be mentioned that I owe this much money of zakah. Good question. All right. Hopefully, all of that clarifies at least how we are going to calculate our zakah personally. And this is, again, it's a general overview, a general outline. It is, if you keep this general overview outline, at least it'll help you navigate through how much zakah you're going to be paying this year. Everyone has their own personal circumstances and situations and scenarios. If you have more specific questions, you can always email me, right? The F Zubairi at instituteofknowledge.com, FZUBAIRI at instituteofknowledge.com, and I will try my best to answer those questions of an individual nature. Is zakah an obligation for a child who has their own savings? No. So according to the Hanafi school of thought, minors do not have to pay zakah even if they own wealth, even if they have the nisab. So minors, their wealth is not subject to zakah. All right. We are going to now cover who is deserving of receiving zakah. Right? Who is deserving of receiving our zakah? So who are the recipients of zakah? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself in the Quran, He highlights 8 categories of recipients. He mentions them specifically. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ وَالْمَسَاكِينِ وَالْعَامِلِينَ عَلَيْهَا وَالْمُؤَلَّفَةِ قُلُوبُهُمْ وَفِي الرِّقَابِ وَالْغَارِمِينَ وَفِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ. These 8 categories are the recipients of zakah. فَرِيضَةً مِّنَ اللَّهِ, right? As an obligation from Allah. وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ حَكِيمٌ. Allah is the all-knowing, the all-wise. So in this verse, which is verse number 60 of Surah At-Tawbah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتِ. So again, we find Allah using the word sadaqah, which is the plural of sadaqah, but here it's referring to zakah. According to all of the mufassirun, according to all of the scholars of the Quran, the word as-sadaqat is referring to zakah. And innama in the Arabic language is known as kalimatul hasr. It makes it exclusive, right? It makes the sentence exclusive. And that's why we translate it as only. So charity, meaning zakah, is only for the poor, al-fuqara, al-masakin, the destitute, wal-amilina alayha, workers who collect it, right? Wal-mu'allafati qulubuhum, whose hearts are to be reconciled, wa-fir riqab, slaves, wal-gharimin, people in debt, wa-fi sabilillah, in the path of Allah, wa-ibn sabil, and wayfarers. So zakah is only for these 8 categories of people. Fariidatan min Allah. This is a mandate. This is a decree. This is an obligation from God. Wallahu alimun hakim. And Allah is the all-knowing, the all-wise. So no individual outside of these 8 categories, no individual outside of these 8 categories is eligible to receive zakah. Right? Because the verse limits them as recipients with the particle only, innama. And this is something that is agreed upon throughout history of Islamic scholarship, that the recipients of zakah are these 8 categories. The differences arises in interpreting what these 8 categories refer to and what they mean. So we will explore each of these really quickly. The first category is al-fuqara. Al-fuqara is the plural of the word faqir, right? And we translate as this as a poor person. So a faqir is a person who owns some wealth, but it's less than the nisab. So according to the Sharia, a faqir, a poor person, is an individual who may own some wealth, but the wealth he owns is less than the nisab. So we just determined that the nisab right now is $4,870 some odd dollars. So if a person has money, but it's less than that, they only have $2,000, they only have $3,000, they are categorized as a faqir, and they are deserving of zakah. Right? They are deserving of zakah. So in other words, a person who does not have to pay zakah themselves. Right? So among the poor, among the fuqara, priority should be given to one's relatives. If you have some relatives you know who are poor and they're deserving of zakah, you should start there. Why? By doing so, you're fulfilling this obligation, and you're also maintaining a healthy relationship with your relatives, so you get double the reward. Then your neighbors, then others according to their needs. Right? Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh, he mentions that the poor person is not the one who asks for a morsel or 2 of food from others, but the one who has nothing and is ashamed of begging from others. Okay. There's some ahadith that just give clarifying of who it is. The second category is al-masakin. Al-masakin is the destitute, or at least it's translated as the destitute. So al-masakin is the plural of the word miskin. A miskin is a person who has no wealth at all. So they are worse off than the faqir. So faqir is a person who's needy, they're poor, because they don't own the nisab. A miskin is someone who has nothing at all, right? Completely broke, dirt poor, extreme financial difficulty, they need help. And these are the two primary reasons for giving someone zakah, that either they're poor or they're needy, right? So these are the meanings that are also found in the other categories as well. So these are the two primary, you could say, recipients of zakah, the poor and the destitute. The third, وَالْعَامِلِينَ عَلَيْهَا, right? وَالْعَامِلِينَ عَلَيْهَا is referring to the zakah collector, right? So a person appointed by the Islamic head of state or by an Islamic government to collect zakah, right? He is paid enough to suffice him or themselves and in proportion to the amount of work they perform, right? So this was a category that was specific to when a khilafah actually existed. That historically speaking, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he would appoint some of his companions as zakah collectors. And they would actually go to different tribes, they would go to different localities, and they would collect zakah. So because they were working, and that work it was taking them away from their earning a livelihood in another way, they were considered to be allowed to receive some zakah from what they collected. And that would obviously be determined by the Prophet ﷺ in accordance to their work. Right? So وَالْعَامِلِينَ عَلَيْهَا was referring to a specific category of zakah collectors that were appointed by the Prophet ﷺ. Or if there's an Islamic government, an Islamic state, a khilafah, and they have actual zakah collectors that are going around and collecting zakah. Now based off of this, there are some modern fatwa and there are some organizations who say that when they're collecting zakah on behalf of the community to distribute it to around the world or to those in need, that they also count as zakah collectors, and because of that they can take a percentage of the zakah they collect to pay for their expenses or to pay for their employees' salaries or whatever it may be. Now that is a fatwa that exists, but that is a fatwa that we completely disagree with and our teachers disagree with as well. That zakah collector is something specific. It's referring to an actual official government duty, an actual official government responsibility. It's assigned by the government, and they go collect zakah on behalf of the government, and as a remuneration for their work, they will be paid a certain portion or certain percentage of that as remuneration for their work. So most scholars, the overwhelming majority, would say that this category necessarily does not exist. Right? There's no amilina alayha, unless there might be in some Muslim countries, but not here. Right? Those who work for relief organizations, we would say do not count as amilina alayha. And if they're collecting zakah, the organization should have 100% zakah policy. That whatever money is collected as zakah, 100% of that should be distributed forward and given to the poor and needy and those that are deserving of zakah. A percentage from it should not be taken. Right? The fourth category is even a little bit more complicated. Al-mu'allafatu qulubuhum, those whose hearts are to be reconciled. So these are people to whom the Prophet ﷺ would give zakah so that they would accept Islam, or to new converts to strengthen their faith, to strengthen their iman. So there were three groups of people included within this during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? The first group was to encourage them to become Muslim so that their people would follow their example and become Muslim as well. So there may have been certain tribes and certain communities that were inclined towards accepting Islam, but they were dirt poor. They were in difficulty, they were in dire need. And if the Prophet ﷺ were to show them ihsan, if he were to show them kindness and generosity and give them charity, it would win their hearts over. Right? And then that leadership, right, the leadership would become Muslim, and following the leadership, the entire tribe would become Muslim with them. So that was one aspect of mu'allafatu qulubuhum, to make their hearts softer. Right? The second was protection against evil and harm. Right? Protection against evil and harm. That if there are individuals that were causing unnecessary harm to the Prophet ﷺ, sometimes he would give them a payment and be like, you know what, take this money and leave us alone. Right? Take this money and stop bothering, stop harassing the Muslims. And the third, if a community accepted Islam, but they were on a weak foundation, and they needed help and they needed assistance, the Prophet gave them assistance to strengthen their faith. Now by scholarly consensus, right, through ijma', this category is no longer applicable. And this is something you will find written in all of the classical books of fiqh. This is something you will find in all of the books of tafsir. That this category is mansukh. This category has been abrogated. And this is based off of a narration from the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, where Uyayna and Al-Aqra' ibn Habis and Al-Abbas came and they asked for their share of zakah from Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. So this is an incident that took place after the Prophet ﷺ left this world during the Khilafah of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. So these three individuals were individuals that were non-Muslims. And they would receive zakah from the Prophet ﷺ to stop their harm, to stop them causing inconvenience. So after the Prophet left this world, they came to Abu Bakr asking for their share of zakah. So then Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he authorized it in writing. And Umar radiallahu anh was in charge of distributing. So they brought this letter to Umar radiallahu anh. Umar radiallahu anh looked at the letter, he tore it up, and he said, this is something the Prophet ﷺ used to give you to reconcile your hearts for Islam. Now Allah has made it needless to you. If you remain in Islam, that's good. Otherwise, between us and between you is a fight. And say the truth is from your Lord, right? وَقُلِ الْحَقُّ مِنْ رَبِّكُمْ فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. Whoever wills, let them believe, and whoever wills, let them disbelieve. So basically Umar said, no way, we're not giving this to you. You're not deserving of it anymore. So they came back to Abu Bakr radiallahu anh and said, are you the Khalifa or is Umar? You gave us the letter and Umar radiallahu anh tore it up. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anh said, he is the Khalifa if Allah wills. Right? Indicating that in the future he would have become the Khalifa after Abu Bakr radiallahu anh left this world. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, he did not criticize Umar radiallahu anh regarding this. And when this came to the knowledge of other companions, they also didn't disagree with it, which is considered to be a form of ijma'. It's considered to be a form of consensus, what they call al-ijma'ul sukuti. So basically, according to scholarly consensus, this category is also no longer applicable. So far we only have two eligible recipients. You have the poor and the destitute. Fuqara, masakin. Number 5 is ar-riqab. Right, number 5 is ar-riqab, which is slaves working to free themselves. Slaves that make an agreement with their owners to be freed if they pay an agreed upon price. In the history, this was known as a mukatab. So, slavery and Islam and the whole institution of slavery, that is a whole discussion for another session. We can discuss that later on in a more detailed session, inshallah. But slavery as an institution is something that existed historically, and it's something that existed in the Arabian Peninsula when the Prophet ﷺ came as a prophet and messenger. So one type of slave was called a mukatab. A mukatab was a slave that entered into an agreement with their owner to purchase their own freedom. That I will pay you $1,000 to purchase my own freedom. And if the owner accepted, they had this contract, and the slave would be allowed to work to purchase their own freedom. So the Muslims were encouraged to help them. Right? Muslims were encouraged to give them zakah so that they could purchase their own freedom. And that's what's meant by وَفِي الرِّقَابِ. So Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, he narrates that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, 3 people have the right to be helped by Allah. The warrior who fights for Allah, the contracted slave who longs to buy his freedom, and one who wishes to get married for the sake of protecting themselves. So riqab is perhaps also not a category that exists anymore. The 6th is al-gharimin, those in debt. Right? A person whose debts take them below the nisab, that they're drowning in debt. They're in so much debt that if they subtract their debts from their assets, it actually takes them below the nisab. Anas radiallahu anh narrated that the Prophet ﷺ said, begging is not permitted except for 3. Those living in abject poverty, those with oppressive debt, and those owing a blood wit who find it difficult to pay. So if you know someone, if you have a friend, a family member, right, a relative who's in debt, and you know they're struggling to pay that debt back, right, and it's hard for them to meet their monthly expenses, it's putting them in financial constraints and difficulty, you can give them zakah. There are legible recipients, or they're legitimate recipients of zakah. A good example of this might be students. Right? Students who might come from a lower economic background and they have student loans and they're in debt and they're finding it hard to pay, you can give them zakah and help them pay off their debt. Number 7 is fi sabilillah, in the way of Allah. Now, according to the mufassirun and according to the classical jurists of Islam, right, this is referring to those who are actually fighting in the path of Allah or pilgrims going to perform Hajj. Right? Specifically those who don't have enough resources to perform their respective duties. So they were allowed to receive some zakah funds. Right? So for example, if a person went to Hajj and on their journey they ran out of money and they need some extra assistance to complete their journey and make it back home. So they would be given a little bit of zakah money. Right? Same thing for someone in the past. They were fighting in the path of Allah. They're part of the Muslim army, but they didn't have enough money to purchase perhaps, a shield or a sword or, protective gear, whatever it may be. They would be allowed to receive some zakah for that purpose, for that reason. Now, some people or some contemporary scholars, right? There are some contemporary scholars who take fi sabilillah and give it this very expansive and exhaustive meaning. And they say fi sabilillah means any act of righteousness, any act of goodness is fi sabilillah. So any act of charity is fi sabilillah, right? Fighting for civil rights is fi sabilillah. Building a masjid is fi sabilillah. Building a school fi sabilillah. Building a hospital fi sabilillah. Digging a well for people that don't have access to water fi sabilillah. Right? So they say you can give zakah to all of these charitable projects. You can give zakah to all of these projects that would benefit the Muslim community. That is a very expansive understanding of the word fi sabilillah, and it is not a classical understanding. The overwhelming majority of scholars said that is not what it's referring to. It is referring to specifically those warriors who don't have enough resources and those people doing Hajj that don't have enough resources. Now, Shaykh Yusuf al-Qardawi, hafidhahullah, he has a very famous book called Fiqh of Zakah, right? Fiqh Zakah. And he writes the following, right, which is a very interesting take, and I will comment after reading it. Right? He says, I believe the term in the way of Allah. I believe the term fi sabilillah includes fighting and activities that achieve the same goal as fighting, which is consistent with the opinion of the majority of jurists. It must also be noted that certain activities may be included as in the way of Allah in certain periods in certain countries, which may not be included in other lands or times. Establishing an Islamic school, for example, though beneficial to Muslims, is not included in jihad. Yet in a country whose educational institutions are dominated by secularists, communists, or missionaries, one of the best means of jihad is establishing an Islamic school in order to protect Muslim children from such destructive and demoralizing preaching. Likewise, an Islamic library may sometimes be only a good and beneficial project, but may at other times in other places be a jihad. Right? The same thing may be stated about an Islamic hospital that protects Muslim patients from being exploited by missionary hospitals and other cultural projects that perform similar tasks. Now that is a very interesting take, that is a very unique take, and it's a take that looks at the maqasid more than the actual detailed rulings. And scholars are entitled to their opinions. But the opinion of our teachers and the opinion of the majority is that zakah cannot be given to charitable projects. Zakah funds cannot be used to build a masjid. Zakah funds cannot be used to build a hospital. Zakah funds cannot be used to dig a well, build a road, build bridges, or any other thing that you can say is fi sabilillah. For all those projects, you can give sadaqah. Give as much charity as you want. But when it comes to zakah, which is an act of worship, which is a pillar of Islam, right? That zakah is wealth that has to be given to an individual, to a needy person. There has to be tamlik. There has to be a transfer of ownership from me to an actual individual. So I can give zakat to someone, maybe to help them pay their tuition because they're needy. I can give zakat to a person to pay for the medical expenses because they're needy. I can give zakat to a person to, so they can purchase food for their family, right? Those would be valid categories of zakat, not these charitable projects. And also specifically when it comes to building a masjid, especially in your locality, especially here in most parts of perhaps Orange County. Right? When I'm giving zakat to my masjid and they're going to use it to construct, I end up benefiting from that. It's almost as if I'm giving zakat to myself. Whereas the purpose of zakah is that I'm giving the wealth to an individual in need, who's highlighted by these categories mentioned in the Quran. Al-fuqara, wal-masakin, wal-amilina alayha, wal-mu'allafati qulubum, wa fi riqab, wal-gharibin, wa fi sabilillah, wa ibn as-sabil. The last one is the traveler, right, the wayfarer, which refers to a traveler who, despite being wealthy at their place of residence, is in need during their journey. All right, so we can choose to give zakah to one person from any of these above categories, or we can spread it out. It's important to remember that there has to be a transfer of ownership of the wealth to an individual from one of the above categories. Again, that is the principle here. There has to be a transfer of ownership of wealth to an individual, to a person, from one of the above categories. And that is why, again, we cannot give zakah to build institutions such as masajid, or hospitals, or schools, or for general public welfare, such as fixing roads or bridges, or other things such as that. All right, so we will not apply fi sabilillah to that category. All right, I will do 2 more slides, and then I'll take a break, and we will go through Q&A, and we will probably end for today at that time. All right, who can't receive zakah? All right, who can't receive zakah? So number 1, zakah cannot be given to non-Muslims. Right? Zakah, as an act of worship, as a financial ibadah, it has to be given specifically to Muslims. When it comes to regular charity, when it comes to general sadaqah, that can be given to both Muslims and non-Muslims. So when we're paying zakah, we should try our best to make sure that it's going to a Muslim individual. It's the right of Muslims. Number 2, it cannot be given to a wealthy person who owns the nisab. Right? We cannot be giving our zakah to someone who is considered by the Sharia to be wealthy, meaning they own the nisab. Right? That would not be valid. That would not be a legitimate recipient. Number 3, parents or grandparents. We cannot give zakah to our parents even though they might be poor, nor our grandparents or great-grandparents even though they may be poor. Why? Because more often than not, it's wajib upon us to take care of them anyways. Right? If they cannot take care of themselves, then the responsibility of their financial upkeep falls on their children. So we have to take care of them anyways, or you can give them sadaqah and charity, but you cannot give them zakah. And another reason is because the benefits of wealth between these family members is oftentimes shared. So if I give them zakah, I will probably benefit from that in some way, shape, or form. Same thing goes for children and grandchildren. We cannot give zakah to our own children, even if they may be poor in need, nor our grandchildren. Why? Because they're under our care anyways. It's wajib upon us to give them nafaqah, to give them expenditure and take care of their expenses as long as they're under our care. Even when they're adults, we are responsible for helping them out if in need. Right? You can give them charity, but you cannot give them zakah, because that benefit of zakah will come back to us. We cannot give zakah to our spouse. Or we cannot give zakah to our wives, and wives cannot give zakah to their husbands. You can give it to your relatives. You can give it to your aunt, your uncle, your niece, your nieces, your first cousin, your second cousin, third cousin, whatever. You cannot use zakat to pay for a deceased person's shroud. Let's say a person passed away, and that person was poor and needy, and they did not have enough money to pay for their funeral expenses. We cannot use zakah for that. Why? Because there's no transfer of ownership. That person is not receiving the money. There's no tamliq. But obviously you can use general sadaqah for that. And that is why we are encouraged throughout the Quran and throughout the ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ to be as generous as possible. There are so many virtues and so many blessings associated with charity, because these charitable acts are something that is encouraged, as opposed to zakah, which is a specific act of worship. Right? To pay off a deceased person's debt. If a person passed away and they're in debt, they owe other people money, zakah cannot be used to pay that off. Right? That debt should be paid off from that person's estate. If they didn't leave behind anything, then perhaps their heirs can take care of that debt. If not, then that debt becomes hadr, yani it won't be repaid because they have passed away. And finally, where should we pay our zakah? This is a question that came up earlier as well, that oftentimes people ask, is it better to pay zakah locally or abroad? And the reason why this question arises is because oftentimes the need abroad is much greater. That there's financial difficulties abroad, there's crises, there's war, there's famine, there's droughts, there's refugees, etc. The answer is that it really depends on the situation. Right? The answer to this question depends on the situation. So generally speaking, under normal circumstances, it is disliked to pay zakah somewhere else. It is better to give locally. So even locally, although we live in a fairly affluent society where there's general economic prosperity, there are still people that are struggling. There are still people that are in need. There are those that are homeless. There are those that are about to be homeless and evicted from their homes. There are those who can't pay the rent. There are those that are struggling to put food on the table to feed their families. There's refugees that have been settled here as well that are going through financial difficulties. So it's much better to pay your zakah locally and help those out in need. But also then give some abroad as well and help those abroad, give some charity for those abroad. Right? It's preferable to pay zakah to relatives, starting with the nearest, then to one's neighbors, then to one's district, and then to the citizens, and then you keep expanding globally. Right? And then when should you pay your zakah? As soon as possible. Right? When should you pay your zakah? It should be paid as soon as possible. And that is one of the reasons why we went through this webinar today, is because most people end up paying their zakah in the month of Ramadan because it's just easy for them to remember. It's an easy way to calculate the year. And the expectation and hope is that perhaps there's more reward for giving it in Ramadan because the reward for good deeds is multiplied in the month of Ramadan. So I have been speaking now for almost 2 hours straight, and that is way too long for me to be speaking and way too long for all of you to be listening. But inshallah, everyone benefited, and it was informative, and it was something that increased your understanding of this very important act of worship. And inshallah, it provided some clarity on how to calculate your zakah and how to pay your zakah. One important thing is that, look, it is much better to pay zakah ourselves, to find an individual who's needy and give them that zakah. Right? Someone who's a faqir, someone who's a miskin, maybe someone who's in debt. Right? Give them that zakah directly. Maybe it's a relative, maybe it's a friend, whoever it may be. But oftentimes, maybe we don't know people in need. So there are these organizations that collect zakah on our behalf. And they basically serve as middlemen, right? They're not collecting zakah. We're not paying zakah to the organization. They will take our zakah, they will hold it as our agent, and they will give it forward. They'll distribute it to those in need. So locally, there are several organizations that do an excellent job of doing so, such as Uplift. Right? Uplift is one of those charities locally that really has a stringent conditions for who they consider to be deserving of receiving zakah. Some of our local masajid also do that they have a formal interview system and a system where they determine if people are deserving of zakah or not. We here at IOK, we have a system, we have a scholarship fund that's based on zakah, right? For those families that are legitimate recipients of zakah, there's a scholarship fund for their tuition, for paying for their tuition. So there's avenues of giving zakah locally, and then obviously there's those organizations that take your zakah and distribute it to refugees or people in war-torn areas, or where there's drought, where there's famine, etc. So it's up to you. It is up to you. It's to your discretion where you want to pay the zakah. The important thing is to pay it, and to pay it on time, and have the intention of doing so as an act of worship, as an act of devotion and submission, and getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and fulfilling this very important obligation. I don't know how true this is, but scholars have written that if every Muslim were to pay their zakah correctly and properly on time, it could help alleviate global poverty. Now that seems like something far-fetched, and it seems like something crazy, but this is what scholars have written, right? Based off of economic models and calculations. If the Muslim Ummah were to calculate and pay its zakah properly, it could help alleviate global poverty. But obviously there's more than just economic factors when it comes to poverty. There's more than just economic factors. There's also some very powerful political and social factors involved as well. Khair. I had a whole session on Sadaqatul Fitr, but since we're going too long, perhaps during Ramadan, I can do a short session for an hour, or maybe half an hour covering Sadaqatul Fitr, or maybe I'll just write something on it and we can post that online. But we will end today with taking people's final questions that we have here. So I did make a mistake. Then on the slide for zakatable assets, it should be 2.5%, not 0.25%. Big difference. Please attribute that to my weak math skills. I have been out of school and I have not done math since I graduated from UCI in 2005. So my math skills are very, very rusty. So it should be 2.5%, 0.025. Good catch. We'll have that fixed on the slide, inshallah. All right, it is income minus any expenses incurred. Okay, so that's just the answer. CEOs of the charitable organizations are zakah collectors? No. So all these charitable organizations that exist, they do not count as the category mentioned in the Quran is عَامِلِينَ عَلَيْهَا. They are not official zakat collectors. So their wages, their salaries, their expenses should not be taken from any zakat funds that are collected. Can we give zakah money to masjid? No. So we cannot give our zakat to the masjid if the masjid is using it for their own expenses. If the masjid is using zakat to pay for their water bill, their electricity, the wages to their employees, if they're using it for construction costs, for capital costs, whatever it may be, no. If the masjid is collecting it as an agent to distribute it forward to poor people, then yes. Right? If the masjid acts as an agent, that the masjid says, look, we will collect zakah, and on your behalf we will distribute it to those in need, then yes, you can. And a lot of masjids just make sure that's what your masjid does. So you can approach your local masjid, you can ask the organization of the masjid that who do you give your zakah funds to, and if they tell you that we hold it on and we pay it to those in need, then you can do so. If someone has investments, for example gold, above the nisab, but their debt takes them below the nisab, are they eligible to receive zakah? Excellent question. So the question is that you have assets, your assets are above the nisab, but then we'll put your debts in, it takes you below. So if that is the case, then technically speaking, you are an eligible recipient of zakah, because you don't have the nisab. So according to the Sharia, you will be classified as a faqir, and you can receive zakah. But there is a very important exception here, and that important exception is that sometimes people may not have the nisab to pay zakah, but at the same time they're not eligible to receive zakah. And that would be that maybe when you look at all their zakatable assets, it doesn't reach nisab. But if you add on their extra things that they own in their home that aren't subject to zakah, like they have extra furniture, extra TVs, an extra car, and you add the value of all those things and it takes them above the nisab, then they don't have to pay zakah, but they also cannot receive zakah. Right? They don't have to pay it, but they also don't have to receive it. And one of the wisdoms behind that may be that we should not have more things that are than needed. We should not have material possessions that we do not need, or that are perhaps out of our means, or perhaps things that we don't really, out of our budget. Like live within your own needs, live within your own budget. Someone related to us would meet the criteria of faqir, but is unwilling to accept zakah because they identify as Hashimi. Do you simply take them at their word, even if you're aware of their financial standing? Is there an organization which validates the Hashimi lineage? I'm not sure if there is an organization that validates it or not, but you would take them at face value, and you don't have to give them, you don't give them zakah. Rather, you can give them charity, you can give them loan, help them out. But even within the Hanafi madhab, there is a position, I forgot the exact details of it, that in the modern era, that this whole stipulation of being a Hashimi was only specific to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. That only during the life of the Prophet ﷺ did this restriction apply, because his family members would receive financial assistance from some portion of the ghanima and Baytul Mal. But after that, after the Prophet left this world, then even his people from his lineage were eligible recipients of zakah. I don't remember the exact details, but that is one position within the Hanafi madhab as well. So if someone claims they're a Hashimi, but they're in need, then technically, according to this, they can also receive zakah. To clarify, an investment referring to personal property such as jewelry, yes. If you have investments like personal property that you have for your own personal needs, but you don't have nisab, then you should not be receiving zakah, but you also don't have to pay zakah. I live in the USA, but I am from India. Can I give zakah to someone in India or someone who's a neighbor? It's better to give to your relatives then, right? When it comes to more reward and what's better, you can give your zakah to your relatives, because by doing so you're getting two rewards, right? One for paying your zakah and fulfilling the obligation, and another for helping out your relative. Right? People here have the nisab but still need help. That is true. Right? There are several people that may have the nisab and they still need financial assistance. If that is the case, then they're not eligible to receive zakah, but you can help them out with charity and donations. That is fine. Is it okay to pay zakah even though we don't have nisab? That's not zakah then, it counts as charity. Right? If you don't have nisab, it's not an obligation upon you, so you do not have to pay it. But if you are paying it, it will not count as zakat technically. It counts as sadaqah, it counts as charity. Na'am. If I have a debt of a car loan, should I clear that or pay zakah? So again, if you have a car loan, then you can deduct the immediate payment. You will deduct the immediate payment, and after deducting the payment, whatever you're left with, you'll pay zakah on that. Should we rely on the organizations collecting or distribute zakah on our own? Very good question. Right? Should we rely on the organization or should we distribute on our own? So it would be much better to distribute zakah on your own. And that serves multiple benefits, right? That serves multiple purposes. And one of them is that you're actually engaging in the act of worship yourself. You're not just relying on someone to do it on your behalf. And you're actually like confirming and making sure that the person you're giving to is needy. And it helps you interact with people and actually see poverty, right? And it might create a more sense of compassion in your heart. It might create more sympathy, more empathy. It might make you willing to give even more and become more charitable. As opposed to when you give it to an organization, it's like out of sight, out of mind. You're not directly involved in it. And secondly, if you are giving your zakat to an organization, just make sure who that organization is giving it forward to, right? That is your due diligence that you should do on your own. That is as part of your responsibility as someone who's performing an obligation, that do your due diligence when you're giving your zakat to an organization to make sure that it's actually going to the poor and needy. All right, so those were all the questions I found in the comments. I'm sure everyone has more questions. If you do, you can still leave them in the comments and I'll visit them later in the evening. And you can always email me at fzubairi@instituteofknowledge.com and I will try my best to answer any questions. This video will be up and will be left up for people to watch later on and benefit from as well. Last question, inshallah. Living in the US, what's the best way to go about giving zakah locally? The best way would be perhaps if you have family, friends, or if you know of anyone individually that needs zakah, that you know their financial situation, you're close enough to know that they need zakah, you can give it to them directly. Or you can go through an organization that deals with local refugees, and they will help you and direct you and tell you who is actually in need, or just give it to one of these organizations that is dealing with people that are eligible to receive zakah. All right, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept this effort of ours. May He place on our scale of good deeds on the Day of Judgment. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep us healthy, to keep us safe. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to reach Ramadan and benefit from its amazing blessings and virtues and opportunities. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us among those وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِلزَّكَاةِ فَاعِلُونَ, right, as described in Surah Al-Mu'minun, that we are those who actively engage in paying our zakah, and that we fulfill this obligation properly and correctly, and that it is accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَصَلِّ اللَّهُمَّ عَلَى نَبِيِّنَا مَوْلَانَا مُحَمَّدٍ وَعَلَى آلِهِ وَصَحْبِهِ وَسَلِّمْ. جزاكم الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. All right, so just as a quick, I guess, reminder or just to inform all of you that inshallah, since Ramadan is going to be so unique this year, that at IOK we are going to continue to offer programming for the community so that everyone can benefit, and we will have specific Ramadan programming where every day from 5 to 6 p.m. I will be going through Tafsirul Jalalain, a classical book on tafsir, which is very concise yet comprehensive. It's only one volume, and I will start it in Ramadan, and the goal inshallah will be to complete the entire work by the end of summer. So that is something we'll start with the first day of Ramadan. Then every evening after iftar, one of our respected mashayikh, one of our scholars and qurra, will read one juz of the Quran, so people at home can follow along and read the Quran along with a beautiful reciter. And after that, there will be a short reminder as well on Quranic principles. So please continue to tune in, encourage others to join and watch, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and the Facebook page, and share the khair, as they say, right? Share the goodness. And please also continue to generously support our efforts. It's through the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and your generous support that helps us sustain all of these programs. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.